The humans asked to join us just because we don't take slaves, the Raikul commander said, his voice shaking the walls of the war room. As if that's a good enough reason to pick a side in this war. They care about morality, not survival. But the worst part is their ships. He slammed his massive fist into the table, sending a tremor through the floor and causing the lights above to flicker. Their ships are pathetic. They design each one to do only one thing. Railguns, lasers, missiles, speed, endurance. Great at one, useless at the rest. What good is a fast ship if it's torn apart after a single hit? Or a powerful railgun that can't even turn to aim? Aquel sat across from him, his 3 eyes fixed on the Raikul, his ears twitching at the commander's annoying voice. The dim room, lit by bioluminescent light, was designed to accommodate multiple species, yet it felt unbearably cramped with the Raikul's bulk dominating the space. The air was thick with the pungent scent of the commander's pheromones, making Aquel shift slightly in his seat. His pink skin, stretched over his tall, spindly frame, strongly contrasted with the Raikul's dark, leathery hide, like a reed beside a towering boulder. Humans, the Raikul added, shaking his head, tusks jutting out as his voice lowered in disdain. They think they're different because they don't take slaves. But what does that matter? This war isn't about morality. It's about power. Control. Aquel's central eye narrowed slightly in irritation. The humans believe they've chosen the side of justice, he said, not bothering to hide his disinterest. He only agreed to speed things along. The meeting had dragged on long enough, and frankly, Aquel didn't care why the humans had joined. Not taking slaves seemed as good a reason as any. Their alliance was made up of species with their own justifications for fighting, most of which only made sense to their own kind. The Raikul snorted, baring jagged teeth. They think their principles will protect them? Naive! Their ships won't last a day in real combat. When the Visay Union comes, ideals won't stop them. What cannon fodder would those stupid human ships provide? Useless. Aquel agreed with the point, but found his anger unnecessary. So what if the humans were useless? What if their ships were an over-specialized mess? They had nothing to lose by accepting them as allies. Aquel figured he and his species would just laugh when the humans stumbled onto the battlefield. Complaining so loudly as the Raikul did seemed pointless. I understand your concerns, Aquel said, his voice calm, but I'm confident the Raikul's proficiency in war will more than make up for the shortcomings of the humans' ships. The flattery was shallow and insincere, but it served its purpose. Aquel wanted the tedious meeting to end, so he could return to his people and laugh about the humans and the Raikul, far from the thick, foul smell that clung to the war room. The Raikul's growling softened, his broad shoulders easing as he leaned back. Our ships and warriors are the best in the galaxy, he said, tusks flashing in a grin. Yes, we will make up for the stupidity of their designs. Their ships may be weak, but our strength will win this war. He paused, then gave a nod. Thank you for your time, Aquel. With that, the Raikul stomped out of the room, his heavy footsteps fading down the corridor. The sudden quiet was a relief. Aquel stood and walked over to the control panel. With a flick of his long fingers, he activated the ventilation system. The low hiss of the air valves purged the stench of the Raikul from the room. Alone in the now empty space, Aquel's ears twitched as he imagined the disaster that would unfold when the laughable human ships finally reached the front lines. Many days had passed, and Aquel now sat in the command ship, surrounded by his people's highest warlords. The room was vast, illuminated by the soft, calming glow of ambient lights embedded in the walls. The table they gathered around was sleek and curved, designed for the long limbs of the Krovac, allowing each of them to lounge comfortably. Some leaned back, long fingers tracing absent patterns in the air, while others talked, their voices low and unhurried. Akel let his 3 eyes scan the room, feeling a deep sense of relief. This space was entirely Krovac. No booming voices of the Raikul, no irritating pheromones, just the quiet, casual presence of his kind. It was a sanctuary where he could be among equals. At the center of the table hovered a holographic display, a glowing map of the battlefield forming before them. Tiny ships, representing both allies and enemies, moved across the display in organized patterns, positioning themselves for the inevitable confrontation. Akel's eyes lingered on the multi-species fleet, a chaotic blend of different technologies and strategies. Soon the time for preparation would end, and the battle would begin. No more rules for combat, no more agreements, just the raw, unforgiving reality of war. Cranal, seated to Akel's right, broke the silence with a snort. His arms were crossed, and he leaned forward slightly as his sharp voice cut through the air. "Look at the wicked ships! Pathetic!" he said, his tone dripping with disdain. "A non-warrior species like them has no place on the battlefield. They should have stayed in their homeworld where they belong." Algi, the tallest and thinnest among them, shifted in his seat. His long fingers tapped the edge of the table as he eyed the display.
"True, but perhaps they might have been useful if they'd come in greater numbers," he said, his tone more analytical. "They're not entirely without potential, but in these numbers, a waste. They shouldn't have bothered to come."
Akel saw an opportunity to join the discussion, and his lips curled into a small smile. None of them had mentioned the humans, who were conspicuously absent from the display. The humans, with their laughable designs and misguided sense of justice. Akel leaned forward, deciding it was time to mock their newest allies. "The Vikrid may be unimpressive, but they're certainly no worse than the humans," Akel said, his voice light with humor. "At least the Vikrid managed to show up on time. The humans, on the other hand, late." His tone grew more playful as he continued. "Their ships are a joke. Railgun ships are so slow they can't turn before getting hit. Fast ships that fall apart if you so much as brush them, and bulky missile carriers with no warp cores. Truly, I could go on for hours." Laughter rippled through the warlords at the table, their long limbs shifting in amusement as Akel's mocking tone filled the room. He leaned back, pleased with himself, as the others chuckled.
"Perhaps we'll have to wait and see how these humans fare," Algi said, a smirk playing on his lips. "If they survive long enough to even reach the battlefield."
Akel's central eye narrowed in amusement. This was why he preferred his own kind. No endless debates, no ridiculous moral posturing, just the simple joy of shared mockery of the absurdity of their lesser allies. But even among his own species, there were always those who spoiled the mood, even in a room full of Krovac warlords. Zorak was one such presence. His skin was a deeper shade of pink than most, and his elongated ears twitched constantly, as if in perpetual irritation. He was the one who would sour any conversation with unnecessary complications and complaints, and today was no different. "The Raikul's fleet seems to be doing better than ours," Zorak muttered, his 3 eyes focused on the holographic display. His words hung in the air like a bad scent, causing Akel's ears to flick in mild annoyance. Akel leaned forward, inspecting the holographic display with a more critical eye. The Raikul's fleet did indeed seem slightly more numerous, and their formation was impressive. Their ships were arranged in a tight concentric pattern, with the heaviest vessels on the outer ring, and the faster, more maneuverable ships in the center. He exchanged a glance with Algi and Cranal, noting that they too shared his opinion on the matter. Zorak's observation, while not entirely inaccurate, felt unnecessary and out of place in a room that thrived on humor. "They might have slightly greater numbers," Akel said, his tone measured,
but I'm not convinced about the quality of their ships."
Olgi, who had been reclining in his seat, stood up with an almost unnatural grace, his long, thin frame towering over the table like a monolith. His pale pink skin seemed to shimmer under the low light as he spoke.
"They look organized now, I'll give them that,"
Olgi said, his 3 eyes narrowing in scrutiny.
"But once the battle starts, their primitive tendencies will get the better of them. They'll break formation and act on emotion. It's inevitable."
Cranal, never one to miss an opportunity to add a joke to the mix, leaned forward, a sly grin spreading across his face.
"Maybe they're trying to compensate for their smell,"
he said, causing a ripple of laughter to echo through the room. Akel felt a wave of satisfaction as the warlords burst into laughter. Even Olgi's serious analysis seemed to lose its weight under the humor, and Zurak's voice was quickly drowned out by the collective amusement. He tried to speak up again, but no one was listening. Another point he attempted to make about the Rykul's formation was utterly ignored, as the rest of the warlords joined in the shared joke. For Akel, it was a victory. The air in the room felt lighter, and Zurak's unfortunate observation was successfully drowned out. This was how Akel preferred it, among his people, where sharp humor and jabs maintained their superiority. The battle loomed closer, and the mood aboard the command ship shifted from casual talking to intense preparation. The warlords busied themselves with final duties. Some delivered speeches to their crews, offering words of encouragement to those about to lay down their lives for the hope of a peaceful future. Others barked at captains in the commons, demanding last-minute adjustments to their formations, frustration clear in their voices. The air was thick with anticipation for the nearing chaos. Akel, however, did none of that. He stood by the holographic display, his long limbs folded, staring at the empty space where the human ships should have been. Their absurd designs were supposed to arrive at any moment, and though Akel had no real expectation of their usefulness, he found himself oddly curious. He watched, waiting. As the agreed-upon moment for the battle arrived, the holographic display labeled friend and foe, and both sides erupted into motion. Thousands of ships, some sleek and gleaming, others bulky and ominous, shot forward from their respective sides like streams of light converging toward the center. The space between the fleets became a deadly storm of energy, missiles, and plasma beams as the vast formations clashed. The void was ablaze with streaks of light, twisting ships, and violent explosions. Akel's 3 eyes darted across the battlefield display, taking in the chaos. Ships on both sides were positioning themselves according to their strengths. Smaller, weaker species formed loose skirmishes, facing off against similarly weak opponents, their formations wavering like leaves in a windstorm. Meanwhile, the larger fleets, those of the Kravak and the Rykul, were assembling, preparing for a decisive confrontation with the enemy's dominant forces. Despite the madness of the battle, Akel found it almost impressive how an odd sense of order had emerged. Different species, each with their own methods of war, naturally gravitated toward battles that suited their capabilities. It was a glimpse into the universal nature of combat. Despite vast differences in biology and technology, there was a certain predictability in how one chose to fight. But soon he noticed something troubling. The weaker species on their side were being decimated faster than those on the opposing side. A grim pattern emerged as allied ships vanished from the display one by one, their formations crumbling under the enemy's pressure. If this continued, the larger fleets, the Kravak and the Rykul, would be forced to compensate for the losses, risking their own ships just to hold the line. Cranal's gruff voice broke through the tension in the room.
"Where are the humans?"
he said, momentarily turning away from his conversation with a captain.
"We could use some cannon fodder right about now."
Olgi, standing beside Akel, looked over with a sharp glint in his eyes.
"Akel, you are the one who recruited them. Surely you know something."
His voice carried a hint of impatience. as if he too was growing tired of waiting for their allies to show. Akel's central eye narrowed, irritation boiling beneath his calm demeanor. The humans weren't just late, they were missing.
I've heard nothing, but knowing the Raikal, I wouldn't be surprised if they bullied the humans into not showing up.
The other warlords exchanged uneasy glances. What had started as a joke, mocking the humans, was now a real problem. They needed cannon fodder, something to slow the enemy's advance. Even the smallest distraction would help. Gone was the mean banter. The room grew heavy with each passing second as the Kravak and the Raikal fleets entered the fray. The reality settled in. They were losing. The enemy's weaker fleets had outlasted their own, and now the strongest ships would have to risk everything to save the battle. But the numbers weren't in their favor. It became clearer by the moment. If they didn't act soon, the end wouldn't be a glorious defeat, but a slow, inevitable decline for their entire species. Most of the warlords leaned forward, their eyes glued to the display, watching in grim silence as their fleets were steadily outmaneuvered. Akel finally broke the silence, his voice calm but carrying the weight of a difficult truth.
"Perhaps it's time to retreat," he said. "Let the Raikal take the greater losses. They're more suited for it."
The room froze. No one spoke against his suggestion, though the weight of his words was heavy. Akel's gaze remained steady as he saw the internal struggle in the other's eyes. Finally, Kranal, the proud warlord who had been the first to mock their allies, made the decision. His voice cracked slightly as he gave the retreat order over the comms. One by one, the other warlords followed suit, their silence signaling their agreement. The jokes were no more. They watched, eyes fixed on the display as their fleet pulled back, leaving the Raikal to hold the line. Desperate messages flooded the comms, the Raikal's growls of rage filling the airwaves. But the Krovak fleet ignored them. The unspoken understanding was clear. Survival was more important than honor today. Olgi broke the tense silence with a dry remark.
"At least we won't be the ones explaining to our people why half the fleet was lost."
His attempt at humor fell flat. The room remained heavy. Sensing an opportunity to ease the tension, Akel leaned back and spoke with a smirk.
"If anyone complains, we can always say at least we arrived on time and participated in the battle, unlike the humans."
This time his words hit their mark. Laughter rippled through the room, a brief moment of levity cutting through the growing despair. But it was short-lived. Suddenly, the holographic display blinked, and a new signal appeared on the battlefield. A single dot, massive and imposing, larger than anything they had seen so far, about the size of a small moon. It dwarfed the rest of the ships, both friend and foe, by a factor of 100. The room fell into stunned silence. Akel's 3 eyes focused sharply on the display, his body going rigid as he realized what had just happened. Whatever that dot in the core of the battle was, it changed everything. Akel didn't need to order a scan of the object. It was already being done. The results came back with nothing. The ship didn't match any known design from any species in the database. Whatever it was new, something they hadn't accounted for. That changed quickly when several bays and hatches opened across the surface of the colossal ship, releasing a swarm of smaller vessels by the tens of thousands. The scanners immediately recognized them, flagging them with a familiar, almost mocking result. Akel's eyes widened slightly as the unmistakable shapes of human ships flooded the battlefield. His voice, filled with self-mockery, broke the tense silence.
"There goes our argument for defending the retreat. Why would the cannon fodder show up now?"
No one responded. His words were utterly ignored. The warlords, too stunned to even glance in his direction. Their eyes remained glued to the display, as if witnessing the impossible unfold. Akel, realizing this was no time for jokes, turned his attention fully to the display. What he saw next made him forget his usual disdain for human ships. The first wave of enemy vessels, eager to test their firepower against the massive human ship, launched an all-out attack. Akel braced himself, expecting the oversized target to be obliterated within moments. He could almost picture it, a massive explosion, the human's hubris punished with swift destruction. But that moment never came. Instead, a formation of bulky, unarmed human ships surged forward, positioning themselves between the incoming missile and laser fire and the giant ship. Akel's jaw slackened as the defensive ship absorbed the barrage, their specialized designs allowing them to take the brunt of the damage with minimal effect. The enemy's attacks, which should have decimated any ordinary vessel, barely made a dent in these flying fortresses. Their armor, designed for defense and nothing else, was holding. Before Akel could fully comprehend what was happening, the next phase of the human formation came into view. The railgun ships, those idiotic, over-specialized vessels that could barely turn, were moving into place. But here, in the protective embrace of the bulkier ships, their slow movement wasn't a liability. They had all the time in the world. Akel's 3 eyes narrowed as he watched the railguns line up, their long barrels adjusting as they took aim. Then came the first barrage. It took time for the projectiles to reach their targets, long enough for Akel to think the maneuver had been pointless. But when they hit, the impact was devastating. The sheer number of projectiles fired was overwhelming, saturating the battlefield with a wave of unstoppable force. The enemy ships, which had initially charged forward with confidence, found themselves unable to maneuver or intercept in time. Every single one of the attackers was obliterated, their wreckage scattering into the void. Akel's jaw dropped as he stared at the display. The humans, the species they had all ridiculed, had just turned the tide of the battle in an instant. The warlords around him were silent, their expressions mirroring his own disbelief. Cranal finally broke the silence, his voice nothing but resignation.
"It won't be enough. We've already retreated. Our fleet isn't even in position anymore."
Akel nodded in silent agreement. The humans' impressive display might have shifted the battle, but their species had already withdrawn, leaving a critical gap in the front line. As the others murmured about their failure, Akel's attention was drawn back to the massive human ship. Another wave of vessels was pouring out of its bays, and this time it was the fast and flimsy ships they had mocked earlier. The speed of these ships was remarkable. In mere moments they had darted through the protective formation of bulkier ships, weaving around enemy fire with almost laughable ease. Their attacks weren't powerful enough to destroy the enemy outright like the railguns, but that wasn't their goal. Whenever the enemy attempted to lock onto them, they would evade effortlessly, retreating back into the protective shell of the bulkier ships if necessary. Akel's gaze locked onto a Visay Union vessel, one of the fastest enemy models, breaking formation to chase the nimble human ships. Laser fire sprayed wildly, missing as the smaller ships twisted and dodged effortlessly. Missiles launched, only to explode harmlessly in empty space. Even the Visay explosive drones failed to connect. The human ships performed impossibly sharp turns and rolls, leaving the Visay ship chasing nothing but shadows. Suddenly, a bulky human fortress-like ship repositioned itself directly in the Visay's vessel's path. In a last desperate attempt to turn, the Visay's thrusters proved too slow, and the massive human ship crushed it with ease, proving even unarmed human ships could secure kills through strategy. What captured the other warlords' attention, however, was the cleverness of the human tactics. The enemy, irritated by the fast ship's constant harassment, would inevitably break formation to chase them down. But pursuing the fast ships meant straying closer to the humans' railgun formation, which wasted no time in launching a devastating barrage the moment the enemies drew near. The strategy was simple but deadly. If the enemy did nothing, they would be slowly chipped away by the fast ships. If they reacted and pursued, they would be annihilated by the railguns. It was a perfect trap. As the other warlords realized what was happening, an uneasy quiet settled over the room. No one spoke. None of them could deny the brilliance of the humans' coordination, and no one could find a reason to mock their designs any longer, at least not when viewed as a single cohesive unit. The once derided ships were no longer a laughing matter. Akel, his gaze still locked on the holographic display, raised the question that was undoubtedly on all their minds. "Should we return to the battlefield?" Again no one replied. Their silence wasn't due to reluctance, but because another shift in the battle had captured their full attention. From the colossal human ship, a new type of vessel had emerged, missile carriers. They moved with painful slowness, lacking any warp core or the speed of their faster counterparts, but they were advancing steadily, taking full advantage of the chaos created by the fast ships and the overwhelming firepower of the railguns. Their acceleration remained constant as they approached the enemy, each missile carrier slowly but surely positioning itself to strike. The warlords exchanged glances, all too aware of what was about to happen. The humans had, somehow, managed to use their stupid ships to craft a strategy that was unraveling the enemy right before their eyes. The missile carriers, comparatively slow in their approach, finally reached their launch positions. Then, in a synchronized motion, they emptied their entire arsenal. Hundreds, if not thousands of missiles surged forward at once, a swarm of explosive death aimed at the heart of the enemy's remaining forces. It was an overwhelming sight, each missile cutting through space, leaving trails of light in their path. The carriers didn't wait to see if their missiles hit their marks. They immediately executed a retreat, their now lightened frames accelerating rapidly back to safety. Akel and the other warlords watched in stunned silence as the missiles found their targets. The enemy ships, already weakened from the earlier engagements, had no defense left. The explosions rippled through the battlefield, consuming one vessel after another. Whole sections of the opposing fleet were torn apart in the blink of an eye, leaving nothing but wreckage floating in the cold void of space. The destruction was absolute. The battle wasn't over yet, but it was clear that victory was inevitable. The warlords' reactions were muted, their postures stiff. They had just witnessed something they never expected. As the missile carriers retreated, Akel noticed something that made his 3 eyes widen in realization. The carriers weren't heading back to the colossal human ship. Instead, they were restocking from smaller supply ships, preparing for another round. Kranal and Olgi began to argue, their voices tense.
"We should join the battle now," Kranal barked. "We can't let the humans take all the glory after our shameful retreat."
Olgi, towering and calm, shook his head.
"The battle's almost over. We missed our chance. Joining now would be more humiliating than staying out."
Akel listened to their bickering, his attention still on the holographic display. He could see the human fast ships, those flimsy vessels they had mocked earlier, darting after the remnants of the enemy fleet. The humans were already pursuing the fleeing ships, cutting off their escape routes, ensuring there would be no retreat for them. As he watched, Akel realized something profound. The argument between Kranal and Olgi was pointless. "The battle's over," Akel said, his voice cutting through the room's tension. The others fell silent, following his gaze to the display. There was no denying it. The humans had won, decisively, without their help. As the realization sank in, the warlords were left in a state of shame. They had retreated, believing the battle to be lost. Yet the humans, those who had been late, those with the stupid ships, had not only held the line, but had obliterated the enemy. And now, all that was left for them to do was watch. Akel sat alone in the same meeting room, thick with the weight of past conversations. He couldn't help but recall the time he'd been here with the Raikul commander, the brute's booming voice shaking the walls as he mocked the humans. The room had felt small then, overwhelmed by the Raikul's massive presence. Now as Akel waited for the human general and that same Raikul commander to arrive, the room felt even smaller, but for a different reason. The looming embarrassment of his species' retreat filled the space as an immaterial force. His spindly frame, once a source of quiet pride among his kind, felt hollow, brittle, as if the shame had seeped into his very bones. His 3 eyes stared blankly at the bioluminescent patterns on the wall, once calming, now a reminder of the order and precision the humans had demonstrated, something his people had failed to grasp. He had been the one to mock the humans. He had dismissed them, convinced that their participation would be nothing more than a brief distraction, cannon fodder to buy time. Now, after the humans' overwhelming victory, whispers spread among his people. Whispers that Akel had misjudged, that his arrogance had led them to retreat when they should have held their ground. He knew the truth. He wasn't solely to blame. The retreat had been a collective decision, the warlords all hesitant to risk their fleet in what seemed like a doomed battle. But someone always had to take the fall. It was the way of war, the way of politics. His 3 eyes shifted uneasily. He had been the one to recruit the humans, the one who vouched for their usefulness. If blame landed anywhere, it would likely be on his shoulders. Just as these unsettling thoughts deepened, the door hissed open. The Raikul commander lumbered into the room, his dark leathery hide gleaming under the dim light. He was an imposing sight, massive, hunched slightly to fit through the doorway. His tusks, jagged and cracked, protruded menacingly from his lower jaw, while his small beady eyes once glinted with fury, but now hid a trace of shyness. Beside him, the human general entered with a contrasting presence. The human was smaller, more compact, but his posture was upright, his expression calm yet exuding a certain sharpness. His uniform was pristine, adorned with various insignia marking something, perhaps victories. The human broke the silence first, his voice steady and clear. "General Oren," he introduced himself, his tone formal but not without warmth. "It's a pleasure to finally meet in person." His gaze shifted slightly toward the towering Raikul commander, who remained silent, looming behind him like a shadow. Akel was caught off guard by the lack of accusations, especially from the Raikul. He had expected a barrage of blame, an attack on his decisions, but the commander stood in silence, his tusked mouth shut tight. It was unlike him, especially given their last meeting, when the Raikul had dominated the conversation with his aggressive stance. After a moment's hesitation, Akel replied, his 3 eyes flicking between the human and the Raikul.
"I must admit, I didn't expect such a cordial reception, given the circumstances."
His gaze lingered on the Raikul for a moment longer, trying to gauge why the fearsome commander was suddenly so subdued. General Oren's expression remained composed as he explained. "Humanity doesn't blame you for retreating. In fact, we didn't plan on swooping in as the heroes at the last moment. There were complications. Adapting to the multi-species battle strategy of our alliance wasn't easy for us." His voice was steady, devoid of mockery, as though he were merely stating facts. Akel furrowed his brow, clearly confused.
"Complications?" he asked, skeptical. "Your strategy seemed flawless. I can't imagine what trouble you could have had, especially after witnessing your fleet's coordination."
The human general chuckled softly, the first break in his stern demeanor. "Perfect, maybe. But our usual tactic involves exiting warp with our mothership, its main cannon already primed and ready. Then we throw a lump of antimatter at relativistic speeds into the enemy fleet to start the fight." Akel blinked, trying to process the audacity of such a tactic. The human paused, his tone lighter, almost amused, as he added, "The only reason we didn't do that this time was that we were afraid it would destroy everything, friend and foe alike." There was a brief, stunned silence as Akel's 3 eyes shifted toward the Raikul commander. For the first time, he fully understood why the hulking figure had been so unusually quiet. Perhaps not saying anything that would risk the human's wrath was a better idea after all.